now we're seeing even seasoned project managers having longer job searches. Everyone can agree with me? Unexpected transitions, and a lot more uncertainty that we're used to. And that's exactly why this conversation is relevant. And this panel has a diverse group of people, from a baby boomer to Gen X's to, I'm gonna leave everyone to guess. Then we have a Gen Z. And when I calculated it collectively, there's almost like a century of experience here in leadership, project management, and just different types of career transitions. Myself, as an example, I've been through career transitions. I've gone from working in the industry, in corporate Canada and in America, and now I'm fully in academia. And one thing I can tell you is that project management has been an anchor to make those pivots. And also, it's less about your credentials and more about how you can use your skills to become relevant, especially in the market we're in right now. With that being said, I'm going to give each one on the panel an opportunity to introduce themselves, and I'll start with Alicia.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alicia Morgan, and my background is in aerospace and industrial engineering. I started off working in aviation and defense, very heavily regulated, as a lot of people will know. And I transitioned into working more into nonprofits. And I'll say that was a heavy transition because I'm coming from engineering, which is heavy, quantitative data, technical. And if anybody in here has worked with non-technical teams, that communication gap can be huge. And so I had to learn how to tell more of the story and the data. It's not one or the other. And so today I'll talk to you about how do you do that. And earlier you heard in the keynote how very important that is, because if you go in and you're communicating with a marketing person just on data, it may not resonate. So let's think about when you walk away from here how you can have more range and what that actually really means.
I have a curiosity now to go back into the workforce and see what artificial intelligence is doing. My last program was in 2023, and between 2023 and 2026, a lot has changed. I'm sure everyone can agree, and at times I have an itch just to go back on some contract and see what is going on out there. Alicia, from your experience across corporate, nonprofit, and independent work, what signals indicate it's time to pivot? What is the indication that it's time to pivot in your career?
Okay, indication it's time to pivot in your career. We talked a lot about business value. PMI has given us some guidance on what that value is. So does anybody know that equation that the business value has to be greater than what? Effort and expenses. So if you are working on something and you have more effort and expenses, it probably doesn't have a big business value. So one of the biggest indicators about pivoting, I was involved in a project with Dallas College, and it worked with several universities, including UT Dallas. It was called STEMinsight.org. If you go there, you will still see that website. And I was not the project manager. I am PMP certified, but on this project, I was the researcher. So the use cases was getting people interested in computer science fields. Coming back from the industry, it said that people were being trained and certified in all these wonderful skills, but they would arrive in industry, as we talked about earlier, wanting a step-by-step guidance into what to do. And things are moving so fast that we can't give it theirs. So how can we better prepare people when they get certified to understand the practical application of what you're doing? So if you think about, if you look at job trends, what are the current in-demand skills? Do I have the current in-demand skills? And how can I recognize a pattern? So how many people, and I know it's hard, keep artifacts from the projects they work on? So that is very important because in interviews now, they are asking for, can I see a proof of your work? And of course, you have to consider IP, so not share the intellectual property, come up with a case study around it, and really show how you not just on time, on budget, on schedule, but how did you deliver that business value? And we said earlier, business value was what? Greater than what? Effort and expenses. So the first thing you have to do is look at the current in-demand skills. Do I have those? Of course, you have project management skills, but there's a certain set of skills in those artifacts that are telling a story that you may not realize. And you can probably use an AI tool, of course, keeping out the intellectual property, and say, what are the patterns on these artifacts? What are the core set of skills? I'm a project manager, and the prompt and say, I want to see what are the patterns across these fields that I may have and aligning with the job, and you want to be able to lead with that. And one of the greatest things that I had to learn, coming from being an engineer, working in heavy regulated industries, a mentor of mine, I was telling them I was working at a nonprofit museum, I was leading the education department, and I could say, we reached these amount of people, and our client, our customers, we've done this, but what was the outcome? Right? So how do we transform? So you have to think about what you're doing and how it transforms your work, not just an output. So it's very important to think about that. And one last time, so we can really make sure that we remember, what is business value?
Greater than
effort and expenses. And then you want to make sure it's time to pivot. What do you want to do first? Look at the in-demand skills and make sure you have that. And then see how you align. So a big thing about it is you're a specialist in things, right? But you have these core set of patterns and skills. So really think about that.
Thank you, Alicia. I spent most of my career as an independent consultant, and just listening to you, initially when I started as a consultant, I used to feel scared when my contract ends. And I had to reframe what that meant. And I'll explain by saying organizations are making those decisions not specific to you. So it might be that maybe the budget does not support renewing your contract another 6 months, another 1 year. And the moment I was able to reframe that and think of it from an organizational perspective, then I had a strategy to understand why those decisions were made, and also have a backup of a backup should I find myself in a situation why my contract ended abruptly. So that could be my journey into being a multi-hyphenate. I opened an online store. I started teaching adjunct, and now I'm finding myself full-time in academia. But that was not the design like 15 years ago. It was just the insight to see that I'm the architect of my own success. So I can't be passive, especially when I'm working as an independent consultant. I have to have a systems view and try to curate a way that I can easily pivot between different careers. Just wanted to add that. So, Alicia, let's come to your next question. How can project managers differentiate themselves in a crowded and competitive job market?
So we talk about branding, and you want to make sure you're branding with substance and meeting people where they are. So we think about LinkedIn, we share our accomplishments, et cetera. But a huge part of what's going on now is that you want to be able to tell what you've built and the story behind your whole journey. So if I'm thinking about where I started in aviation defense, and I was a project manager in manufacturing at Raytheon, and one of the biggest projects I worked on was a factory rearrange project. And we had to rearrange the factory in 6 months with little to no impact to production. And that was a huge undertaking. And I really developed what I now know is human skills or human in the loop skills, but I didn't know that now, but I didn't know that then, but I know it now. And the first thing that I was told to do was to go down to the factory floor and to film the operators doing their work. Do you know what the reaction was? Actually, one of the operators said to me, What are you, Hollywood? You think this is a production? You're trying to tell us what we're doing? So you're building trust. And if you're thinking about branding, you're building trust. You're building third-party validations of your work, essentially, across whatever you've done. So I went and I observed, and the key point of any branding or thing is to observe people actually doing the work. You don't want to be the thought leader who read a book and that was it. You want to be able to say in an application what you observed. So as a result of that, going down and looking at the operators and their work, we had ergonomic workstations. So that means that if this operator transitions out, we can adjust that workstation to the new operator. We were able to see some bottlenecks. So at the time, we weren't thinking about full AI in the sense that we are now, artificial intelligence automating the tasks. We were thinking about machines. So automated machines, they were actively involved in that. So the result of that, we did do this in 6 months to no impact to production. I could say it was because I was just the greatest project manager, but it was because I was actually observing the people, getting their input. So those surveys and that feedback you get, that matters, and those lessons learned. And really transformed the way I think. And then at the end of that factory, when the circuit card was, before it went out, you still had a human observing and checking it to make sure it was really correct. So I developed brand as being a person that was personable. I am more introverted, the technical person, but I do listen well and incorporate the feedback of everybody I'm working in the solutions. And we talking about multi-generation. So when I had that skill of transformation, when I went into nonprofits, I had to transition my mindset again from just thinking about quantitative to think about story, because I was leading a team of millennials. I'm Gen X. And how many people think self-organizing teams is hands-off and you just check in at your stand-ups or your meetings? Be honest, we might think that. So I got some feedback from my team. I walked in and I'm leading programs for a museum, and it's K through 12 programs. I have the project management skills, the strategy skills, et cetera. I'm not the expert in creating the curriculum and the programs. I know that. And so I had some feedback for the team. We feel like you're a stranger to our team. And I'm thinking, I'm not a micromanager. I'm just letting you do the thing you do best. But that feedback told me again, human in the loop, to be present, to observe what they're doing, so that when they're giving information and I'm talking to senior leaders, I could have a firsthand insight onto doing that. So you want to make sure, not only as a project manager, what are those other core skills that you can have? So for me, that is that observation, being that human in the loop, and taking that observation back to the team. So really brand yourself as someone who knows the practical application. So I was going from a formal environment, heavy regulations, to an informal education environment, but the rules still apply. They're still humans. Self-organizing doesn't mean just hands-on, hands-off. So just think about that.
The plan of the symposium. So I have a question, Alicia. I know you've made some pivots, and I've seen the work you've been doing on artificial intelligence, quite impressive. You've almost moved from like a consumer, and you're now almost like a practitioner learning different things. So my question is, how should project managers responsibly engage with artificial intelligence and innovation while maintaining credibility?
Wow. So I will use an example. I'm currently working on a project that's coming to an end, supporting a nonprofit museum that wants to modernize. And one of the things is, I talk about human in the loop. So my team is called Artsies. And I am working with high school interns to train them as AI consultants. I'm not sure what generation that is. And one of the big things about the skepticism that everyone has about AI, even they have it. So we think about them being digital natives and they were going to automatically do that. So one of the things that we did from the very beginning, when you think about responsible AI, you should think about governance, risk, and compliance from the very beginning, not as an afterthought. And I'm one of the AI coaches, and one of the AI coaches on our team is blind, so we think about accessibility, and just thinking about the guardrails that you need to have in place. And then really checking in, we are using an AI tool called PicX. So we are taking all the museum's artifacts, uploading it to the tool, using all their tour guides, manuals, all of their compliance stuff, and to make sure that it's responsible using whatever tool you're using to make sure the sources of the data. So where is it pulling it from? Is it your own internal cloud or external sources? So it's not pulling from the internet, because then you have to worry about hallucinations. And then once you are prompting it to identifying your prompt, does it do what it actually says to do? So one of the things that I really learned is that when you're doing a build, don't demo and build in the same format. So you have a demo of the tool and then a final build of the tool so you can inform the decision. So just thinking about putting that GRC in there from the beginning and accessibility from the very beginning. And I learned that also working at another museum. So that's why it's important to have artifacts from your career, because you never know when it's going to come up in another aspect. So one of the things why accessibility is, and Suna could tell you that, is so important. When I was at a museum, someone called in and said that they wanted to have a tour and that we needed to hire an interpreter. So my team did not know that we're required by law to do that. So one of the managers on our team said, no, we're not going to do that. Well, I had to call them, clean it up, find an interpreter, because we are required by law to do that. So when you think about responsible AI, I highly encourage you, in whatever your industries, if you're in the room, to tell them to highly consider accessibility in addition to GRC, because that's all important. So again, that pattern across my career has shown that human in the loop is very important.
Thank you, Alicia. One more question, and everyone gets to answer. I'll start with you, Alicia. So, what is one action a project manager can take in the next 60 days to improve job readiness?
I'll give you some homework. Has anyone ever heard of the book called Range by David Epstein? It says how generalists triumph in a specialized world. So you have this core skill of project management, and then we think about core competencies, but you also have these other generalist skills that can help you in many different aspects in industry. So I encourage you to read that book. And outside of project management, looking at your artifacts, asking yourself, what other set of skills, and we talked about that current demand list that you can use, but that will really heighten your perspective, because you want to be a specialist, but also have a growth mindset and figure out what other generalist skills you have.
Thank you.
During restructures, like this is just a culture of restructures these days. You mentioned about networking internally to show your value, see what transferable skills you have. One thing that I wanted to say is also, a lot of times we work with external vendors or even possibly other competitors on programs, especially in the government space, regulated industries. Network with those external folks. Share what you can, of course, but collaborate, see if there's opportunities to collaborate.
What's the biggest mistake you would say that new project managers make, either from experience or from what you've witnessed? And the question is for anyone.
Okay, you can answer that.
The biggest thing you underestimate, know that the PMP exam is changing to being more scenario-based, is assuming that what you've done or what you've learned is going to be static and it's the only path to go. You're going to have to learn how to tailor what you're doing to the exact situation. And because if you don't, you could lose a client or customer. Or if you start working, you're new and you've had success and you, again, self-organize, you think things is working, but to check in, I have a cautionary tale. I was working with a team and at a museum that I was working at, and we were at risk of losing the customer because we didn't know that their requirements had changed for what they need, and we were doing things to the old requirements. And so we had to tailor our solution. So underestimating the value of needing to tailor even after the project is in place is something that is a big lesson learned for me.
What are some of the signals for you that tell you it's time to move on to something else.
So to add a little bit more about the networking, like if you feel like you're not moving or growing, one of the biggest things that you have to realize is social capital. So you think about influence, you're always building or borrowing social capital. If you find yourself borrowing more, you find yourself trying to build more, you're going to hit a plateau because there may be rooms of decision makers you can't get into. And so you want to make sure that you are also in interactions, you're being transformational, not just transactional. Hey, this is what I need. Can you do this for me? And that is more of a long-term thing, and you're building that over time. So just really always think about, for my next move, in this situation that I'm in, if I find myself that I have to build, which is very harder, then it might be time to move on because I need to be able to borrow. And that's why you're building your portfolio online. You're showing how you build things. So when you have those discussions and you get in the right room at the right time, you have that information, and then it can become more of a seamless conversation.
And I'll add that it's also important to know what's happening in the geopolitical landscape, in the business landscape, because things are changing rapidly now. There was a time I used to look at like the resource plan to see if my contract will be extended. So once I see I'm only planned out till June, then I know that my contract potentially would not be extended. So I relied on spreadsheets for that information. But we're in a different generation now, right? We're in a different time where there's so much happening in the geopolitical landscape. So you have to keep your ears to the ground, listen to the news, and inform yourself, right, outside of what's happening in your organization.